So did you vote James Roberts?
James. James is doing some
I know he's from Kevin.
consulting stuff with us at the moment. So he was with TPA for 5 years. So he's just doing some consulting stuff, basically to keep them off the streets.
And he's backing Kevin quite hard, isn't he?
Yeah, he's doing parliamentary.
Quite milky. Thank you. And a sugar. Sorry. Sorry, Sam.
I think these are on now, so. I know, yeah.
Looks like you've been getting really good turnout then, by the sound of it.
Yeah, despite the fact that this is like the 10th event on winning about young people, so
Yeah.
glad people haven't got.
We seem to be going from one panel to the next. Like, young people.
Well, you're the only MP under the age of.
Well, I'm not actually.
Well, it's Lewis actually. Yeah, Lewis.
Well, Shivani's younger than me actually. Shivani. The problem is she's on no one's radar because she wants to see North Dakota win.
Where's your Windsor? So
So it's like everyone's all like, he might probably not win. And I love him as well.
Looks like you've been getting great attendance for.
right. Well, hello. Hello. Right. I think we'll make a start. Apologies for the late start, everybody. Quick bit of housekeeping at the end of this event. The whole room has to clear, so please do leave at the conclusion. The topic of discussion today is how can the Conservatives win back young voters? I'm led to understand it's not the only event on this topic at this conference, but I'm almost convinced that this panel is uniquely going to have the answers. So I'm very glad that you've chosen this one to come to. So just to lay out a few key facts before I open it up to our excellent panel. In 1983, the Conservatives won 42% of the 18 to 24-year-old vote. In 2024, that was just 8%. The age at which people are more likely to vote Conservative over Labour is now into the 60s, i.e. basically when you become eligible for the winter fuel allowance, if you are still eligible for it. At the 2024 general election, Conservative flagship policies were the quadruple lock, banning smoking for future adults, and national service for the young. Young people with an undergraduate degree now face a marginal tax rate of 51% above £50,000, 57% if they have a postgraduate degree. For a UK couple on an average salary, net childcare costs account for a quarter of average household income. It's one of the highest in the OECD. And the average age of first-time buyers is now well into the 30s, having been just 23 in 1960. Yet what has the response been of the Conservative opposition so far to those worrying statistics? Well, the main thing that the Conservative opposition has focused on over the last couple of months has been opposing means testing the winter fuel allowance. So there's some key questions for the panel. How can the Conservatives win back young voters? Can the Conservatives win back young voters? And given the fact that the party is now so reliant on the old, should they even bother trying? I remind you that not only have they lost the 18 to 29-year-old vote, they've also lost the vote of those in their 40s and their 50s, and maybe should they be the priority over young voters. So to introduce my panel, we have Alice Denby, who is the opinion editor at City AM, Jack Rankin, the newly elected MP for Windsor and Maidenhead, Scarlett Maguire, Director of polling company JL Partners, and Sam Bidwell, who's the Director of the Next Generation Centre at the Adam Smith Institute. And we'll start left to right. So Alice, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. This is actually the third panel on this topic I've been invited to speak. I think there's another one happening right now, and I don't say that just to boast, though I'm very flattered that I'm still considered young. But it's to show that the Conservative Party, I think, really does get this problem, right? We understand that losing younger voters, and younger voters is essentially everybody of working age now, is an existential problem for the party, and it's one that we need to fix. And I think we all know why. You heard it from Elliot. We know why young people have abandoned the Tories. It's because everything that makes you a Conservative, home ownership, a family, a good life, connections to your community, the way that you build those kind of little platoons that Burke talked about that rise to a love of country, have been denied to young people because Conservatives have fundamentally lost their way. We know the policies we need to change it. People like Sam are doing amazing work, and the TPA as well. So we know what we need to do. We know it's about home ownership. We know it's about childcare. We know it's about tax. But we're not in government, so it doesn't matter what policies. We need to do that work, but ultimately our policies don't matter. What it is about now is about rediscovering our intellectual roots. The party has lost its way, and that is why, after 14 years of Conservative government, the country's no more Conservative. Our institutions are more left-wing than ever, completely captured by this anti-British decolonisation narrative. The rule of law has been completely eroded by riots, by prisoner releases, by crisis in policing. It's harder than ever to start a family if you're like me. I think I'm actually the oldest person on this young person's panel, the granny of the panel. But if you have a child, you will know what a struggle it is to afford childcare, to keep working, to achieve your career aspirations while being a good mother. All of those things have completely broken down. So the Conservative Party needs to rediscover what it believes in. And I think this is also fundamental to winning back young people, because we all know that it's not currently cool to be a Conservative. We all know that people, I don't know what they think, that we're nasty, that we're lame. But young people are interested in ideas, right? Fundamentally, if you want to win back young people, if you want to kind of win the argument on campuses, you need to be talking about ideas. The left has one big idea, and that is socialism. And that, we know as Conservatives, is a doctrine of despair and decline and poverty. So we need to fight back. We need to rediscover our spirit of believing in things. And I think that is one of the keys to winning back young people. And then I also think another thing that's fundamentally, I think what really frustrated me, I was at Labour conference as well, to hear Keir Starmer talk in his speech about Beethoven and Bach. No Conservative would ever say that at a conference speech. We'd be too embarrassed. We'd think, oh, it makes you look out of touch. But Conservatism should be about having high standards. And when in government, the one area where we did achieve good things and real reform and progress was in education, where we stuck to incredibly high standards, to a knowledge-rich curriculum, examinations. And that, I think, is another thing that we need to get back to. And I think that young people would also, I think that is also appealing to young people, because it's a message of hope and aspiration and of quality. So that's my initial thoughts.
There you
go. Jack?
Yeah, I agree with everything Alice has said there. I'm 32 years old. I know I don't even look that age, and I sometimes quip that it feels like everybody who supports a Conservative under 40 went to my wedding. And looking at this room and seeing 5 or 6 of you who did come to my wedding probably brings that home a little bit, right? But it's no longer just under 40s, which is the problem, which is what you mentioned. You know, it's anybody of working age, right? Anybody under the age of 60, anybody who's working age is not supporting the Conservative Party. Right? And Churchill used to say that if you weren't a Liberal by 20, you had no heart, but if you weren't then a Conservative by 40, then you had no head. But it's not the years adding on to you that makes people Conservative, but rather it's going through those gateposts of a life well lived. It is buying a house. It is having a family. It is discovering the joys of compound interest in your ISA, in your pension, right? It is getting promoted and paying more tax, right? You discover that the facts of life are indeed Conservative. And the problem is that young people are no longer making those steps. So it's not a surprise that people aren't becoming Conservatives and aren't becoming capitalists. And for me, and we've mentioned it, the primary reason for that is housing, right? We talk about family and we talk about work, but the things that family formation is being stuffed up by the housing issue as well. They're quite interlinked issues. And I think one of the things we should also address is, frankly, uncontrolled mass immigration into this country, right? So we do need to build more houses, but at the moment we build 130,000 houses a year. We need to build 300,000 just to keep pace with our current immigration assumptions. We've got a 4 million backlog. So not only do we need to build more houses, but we also need to get out of a position where we're trying to bail out the Titanic. So there are issues where we have to just be fundamentally Conservative as well. And I think about my personal political journey. You might hear that I'm not from Windsor originally. It won't surprise for hear me to tell you that. You know, I grew up working class background in Greater Manchester. My first memories of my parents coming home from night school, my father to do his electrical qualifications, my mother accountancy qualifications, and they set up a small business. That's small beer to a lot of people in the Conservative Party, perhaps, but it gave me and my brother life opportunities they could never have dreamed of, right? And that's the hope that the Conservative Party needs to be about. We need to be less shouty and less angry and more open and hopeful about the future, but that story requires that people can build capital in their lives, and that's what we've not got at the moment. But I want to finish my opening remarks on a statement of hope about the future direction of our party. Many of you might have seen in the Times today that 22 of 26 of the new Conservative MPs signed the Next Generation Tories letter. That talks about housing, it talks about marginal rates of tax on work, it talks about childcare. So my message to you is that the new generation of Conservative MPs coming through, we know that this is an existential problem to our party. At the moment, we're in a demographic cul-de-sac of our own creation. We need to get out of that for electoral purposes, but most of all, we need to get out of that because it's in the country's best interests.
Thank you, Jack. I'm glad we covered the joys of compound interest nice and early. Scarlett?
You know, I completely agree with Jack in the sort of demographic time bomb that the Conservatives are facing form an existential problem for the party. And I think they sort of shouldn't kid themselves about this. So, I mean, 12% of young people say that they think the Conservative Party looks after their interests. That's actually more than voted for them at the election. And given Elliot's introduction, it can be surprising it's even that many, given some of the policy announcements that we were used to hearing from the Conservative Party, and given the sort of absolute, I think, even refusal to pretend that young voters and young people was something that the party has been interested in, and that, I think, has been going on for a long time. That compares to 59% for Labour. They think 59% of young people think that Labour looks after their interests. Again, I think that's actually in some ways slightly surprising, because I think both parties are slightly guilty, or very guilty, of ignoring, again, the concerns of younger people. And I think the trend that we are seeing from a polling perspective, I'm sure you can all relate to this anecdotally as well, is that young people are switching off main parties. So I think that there's something that the Conservatives really need to think about, which is that although reforms appeal to younger voters was slightly overstated given how votes were actually cast at the election, it is true that slightly more younger people voted Reform than they did Conservative, which is quite astonishing. There's a massive gender divide on that, actually, so it's many more men voting Reform and women actually increasingly turning towards the Green Party. But something that you're seeing amongst young people, so under 30s, and then actually we've polled 16 to 17-year-olds as well, is turning their back on mainstream parties and just feeling that politics is not working for them. And again, that doesn't surprise me. If I think about my friends, you know, probably relatively affluent and educated group of people, I was in a very small minority for voting at the last election. Didn't even necessarily feel brilliant about the vote that I was casting, but you know, I did go out and vote, and I was very rare. And again, we're seeing that turnout is really dropping. So when people are going to vote, they are increasingly going for smaller parties and turning away from the Conservatives and from Labour, and often not voting at all. And I think this stores up a massive problem. It's a democratic deficit. I think that then makes it hard for whoever is governing to enact policies, especially bolder policies. And then I think the other thing I just want to talk about, which is talking again on issues that have been raised so far about policy issues, I think there can be a misunderstanding about what differentiates younger voters from older voters in terms of their priorities. So in an awful lot of ways, they look similar. And this actually includes things like the environment, which I think often people think that younger people care loads more about the environment than their older peers. If you look at the quite crude metric of, you know, say, what issues are in your top 3 priorities, that is not the case when you compare the environment. They have a slight preference to list it, but not a massive one. The massive difference is housing. Vast amounts of younger people, vastly more, place housing in their top 3 issues, and that is battling with the economy and healthcare for something they want to see addressed. And I think that, again, I think that will probably come on to talk about that a lot this panel, but I think that is one of the things that's been most neglected and one of the reasons why the Conservative Party are looking down this black hole.
Thank you, Scarlett. Sam?
Thanks very much, Elliot. And Alice, I'm not competitive, but you said you've been invited to 3 panels on this subject. I've got 4. So to preserve my own sanity and the sanity of everybody else in the room, I'm going to keep the housing bit short, because you're going to hear a lot about housing at these panels. Housing is absolutely a necessary part of the Conservative Party's efforts to reconnect with younger people. There is no way that there's going to be a mass changing of minds amongst young people unless the Conservative Party starts advocating for a change to the planning system that allows more houses to be built, giving people more home ownership. That's me on housing. I'm done. Because I actually think that housing is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. It's a symptom of a broader economic problem that we've got in this country, which is turning young people away from traditional conservative values and towards what I would probably call a kind of passive centre-left mindset. Most young people are not kind of just stop oil loony lefties. They are quietly going along to the ballot box to vote for the Labour Party. They don't think too much about politics. There's always been a core of typically university-educated people. You find this going right back to the 1600s, who are very left-wing, have very radical ideas. Thomas Hobbes once said that the universities have been to England what the wooden horse has been to Troy. So for a very long time, we've had this problem with university graduates. The bigger issue is this great mass, the great kind of majority of young people who now think, well, I broadly feel like equality is a nice idea, and probably the government should step in and prevent these harms, and I'll therefore go along and I'll vote for the Labour Party, because they say broadly the same things that my friends in my cultural milieu say. And the core issue, is that we've transitioned in the last 30 years from an economy in which most people make their money day to day in the private sector. They do so by working hard, taking risk. Many of them are in salaried employment at big corporations traditionally, but also you've got more of a startup culture, more small businesses, etc. We've transitioned from that model to a model where a majority of people owe their livelihoods in some form or another to the bureaucratic state. So if you look at the number of people, you just take a broad swathe of the population, you look at the number of people who are employed directly in the public sector, and then the number of people who are employed in roles which are created by the regulatory state. So that's compliance, HR. I can give you some numbers on this. The number of people working in HR since 1990 has increased by 10 times. The number of people working in legal compliance by 20 times. The number of people in environmental compliance by 50 times. Your young professional is now just as likely to owe their livelihoods to bureaucracy and regulation as they are to money-making, wealth creation, etc. So we have moved away from that kind of naturally conservative system where, of course, people are going to prefer low tax if they're going out and earning money, to a system where actually people benefit from there being more regulation, benefit from these new quangos that politicians seem to come up with every 15 minutes. And so if you want to re-engage young people as a Conservative Party, you can't just talk about housing. Housing is a symptom. Right? Housing is another aspect of an economy in which we seek to eliminate all negative externalities, all harms. We say if you're an asset owner, we want to protect your asset. We want to make sure that there's no risk to you, no risk to your to the enjoyment of your house, and so we won't build any houses. So this is the same anti-risk mindset that leads us to create. We've gone from something like 20 regulators in 1997 to 95 today. It's a huge increase. It's the same broad instinct that underpins it. If the Conservative Party wants to start winning with young people again, it needs to start advocating a complete change to that mindset, to go from a world in which the job of government is to eliminate harms to a world in which the job of government is to facilitate growth, celebrate risk, celebrate success, celebrate innovation, celebrate wealth creation. You will win young people for 1 or 2 elections. You talk about housing. If you deliver it, you'll win a couple of them for life. But if you really want to capture young people, capture the next generation in the way that Thatcher captured the Essex man, you need to start making sure that people are working in an environment in which they can A, make money, but in which B, they are reliant on themselves, their family, their own hard work, rather than government bureaucrats creating new regulation. There's got to be a complete change to how we think about the economy.
Before I open it out to questions, I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and actually come back to you, Sam. So Ed West wrote in a really interesting Substack recently about how the Conservative Party has always stood for institutions and defending institutions. But if you're on the right and you're young, you look at most of the institutions now and you think that they've been taken over by the left, and so actually the correct approach is not to defend those institutions or conserve them. It's actually to destroy them and dismantle them. To what extent do you think that's a threat to the Conservative Party, and how does the Conservative Party address that? How does it regain the trust of young people, young right-wing people in institutions?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think it's something that the Conservative Party has been spectacularly bad at, is articulating an alternative view of institutions. So, 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago is fairer, most of the institutions in Britain broadly were conservative in inclination, right? Many of the people leading our major regulators, our the BBC, etc., have been appointed by the Thatcher governments. These were people who, were kind of not necessarily aligned entirely with the politics of the 1980s and the Conservative Party, but who were certainly more open to it. Then came 1997, and in my view, the most consequential British Prime Minister of the last 50 or 100 years, Tony Blair. And there is a man who understands if you fill institutions with your people, those institutions start behaving a bit like you. They start doing the kind of thing that you would like. And as you rightly point out, the Conservative response has either been to live with it and let the civil servants get away with it, let regulators get away with it, let judges get away with it, etc., get in the way of political decision making, or there has been this kind of countervailing instinct, which has been, okay, burn the whole thing down. And actually there is a middle ground, which is to say, no, the left had its march through the institutions in the New Labour years. We can also have a march through the institutions. We can appoint good people to these posts. There is no reason that when Boris was looking at appointing Dacre to head up the BBC, that he should have been bullied by the press into backing down on it. He should have appointed his man to lead the BBC. We would be living in a very different world had he done so. And there is no reason that across 14 years of government, the Conservative Party could not have filled these institutions with right-minded people who were broadly aligned with the Conservative vision. Now, of course, I think some of these regulators and quangos need to go. I think they are absolute anathema to a kind of high-growth, dynamic, enterprising, democratic system. But those that we want to keep, we can fill with good people. And there's no reason we can't do that.
Jack, I believe you want to come in on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree largely with what Sam's got to say there. And I think about this challenge about whether attacking some of these institutions is conservative or not. And I think about Brexit. So Brexit was often characterised as a quite radical, and some would say anti-conservative notion, but I always saw this as the British Constitution that the Conservatives want to protect is 1,000 years old. And actually, it was the creep of the European Union was radical, and it was a deeply conservative act in order to restore to the British Constitution. And I think getting rid of a lot more of the Blairite constitutional framework actually fits in the same kind of guise. And I think one of the problems that we've had this drift over the past 14 years of Conservative government is we've been in office and not in power. And we've been in office and not in power because of the depth of these institutions, as Sam says, stacked to the brim with kind of Blairite functionaries that we've just continued to cycle around. So I think the first act of a new Conservative government has got to be some kind of, Great Reform Act, which frankly is going to get rid of a lot of these things and bring a lot more things within ministerial purview, and also, repeal legislation, the Equalities Act, the Human Rights Act, the Charities Commission, all this stuff needs to go whole whack. Crown Nominations Commission. We need to get our thinking in order in the next 5 years, so that in the first 100 days we can get rid of that. But then what we keep, there needs to be somebody whose job's in the Cabinet Office is to have 1,500 Conservative CVs appointable to these public offices, so that over time, in the next 5 years of a Conservative government, we start to appoint these institutions and shape them our image. Sam's quite right.
Scarlett, a lot of the conversation about the Conservative Party at the moment is about whether or not they should tack to the left or tack to the right. In that very simplistic narrative, which do you think would appeal more to young voters?
I think it's a false dichotomy, actually, and that's something I've found myself saying quite a lot over the last few days. It seems like the sort of simplistic way of tackling this conference for some Conservatives is to mount an argument to go after Lib Dem voters or go after Reform voters, and I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think that for a couple of reasons. I think firstly to say those who defected to Reform and those who defected to the Liberal Democrats look more like each other than you would think, and the ones who moved from the Conservatives to the Liberal Democrats look very different actually from your people who voted Liberal Democrats, say 2017 and 2019, and those Reform defectors and those Liberal Democrat defectors share very similar priorities, namely immigration, public services and the economy, much like the public as a whole. So I don't think it's necessarily about tacking to the left or to the right. I do think, though, I think Sam raises a very interesting point, and or several. But I think there's going to be there's a slight issue here with messaging. So I think one thing that young people are desperate for is this sense of an authenticity of vision, which I think you can say can come in several different forms. I think that's part of the appeal that something like Reform is clearly getting more right with younger voters than the Conservative Party. They are able to present themselves as having something that is more, I think, consistent and again authentic. I think that's driving part of the way the turn away from mainstream parties generally, as we've already touched on. And I think that's really where the Conservatives should be looking, is something optimistic, something futuristic, focusing on young people's concerns, and not get bogged down in a sort of left versus right fight, because I don't think it's that simple, and I don't think young people are that simple either.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it is about having a battle of ideas. I think if this is something that Keith Joseph understood, that's why they founded the Centre for Policy Studies. They understood that the post-war consensus had been a leftward drift, and the country was just drifting towards socialism. And if you want to turn that around, you actively need to have ideas, and you need to change the climate of opinion. And I just think the other thing I would like to pick up on is Sam's point about risk. I obviously spend a lot of my time talking to people who work in the city, talking to people who run businesses, and this is their biggest frustration is the lack of an appetite for risk in this country, and endless red tape, endless change, having to figure out new rules all the time, and they just feel like this is just not a very pro-business country. And again, that's something it's about an attitude change rather than a left or right or particular policies. It's having that vision and a set of ideas that can appeal to people and celebrate risk-taking, growth, entrepreneurship, aspiration, wealth, all the things we believe in.
And probably perfectly captured by Starmer's desire for the government to take back control of people's lives. Right. Right, well, I think we'll open it up to questions now. So if I could see some hands, please. We'll have the gentleman here at the front.
Thank you very much for those very sound comments. I'm 22 years old. I've been at other panels and people have commented that some of the biggest issues my generation are facing is the fertility crisis and demographics change, and also the increasing sectarianism of politics. And we've had, 4 or 5 openly sectarian MPs elected to Parliament. What are you going to do about it, and how are you going to convince young people to vote Conservative to deal with those challenges?
Anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can take that on. Just the easy ones then. Look, that you've touched on 2 very big policy areas, both of which I'm super interested in. Sectarianism in particular actually is something I've written on before. Not to sound terribly arrogant, but I predicted the 4 seats week 1 of the election, because it's so obvious that this is where we've been going over the past 3 decades, is that we've failed completely on integration, that we have lots of people have come into the country from places with very different values, and we have done a very poor job of integrating those people into the kind of normative culture that's been built up here over 1,000 years or more. So that's obviously a massive problem. I think as Jack was saying, that the first step is to take a more measured approach to migration, to stop adding to the problem. Of course, as we know, most of the people who were turning out to vote for these sectarian independents have been here for generations, so it's not as simple as turning off the tap, but it would be a good start, because part of the problem is that we've got a churn in that population. So when you add people from those countries who share the beliefs and have come fresh at it, they kind of reinforce the existing norms in those communities. You don't get people peeling off as you naturally would in communities that are perhaps a little bit better integrated. And on the fertility crisis, if anyone in the room can solve that, you will be very, very rich, because no one in the world, no policymaker seems to have been able to do it. Almost every country in the world is now drifting towards a sub-replacement fertility rate. You look at a country like India. India, many years ago, had a fertility rate of about 6. That was in 1980 or so. Had a fertility rate of about 6 children per woman. It's now hovering at about 2, which is where we were only a couple of decades ago. We're now at about 1.5, 1.6. Everybody's precipitously falling off. And it just isn't clear. None of the explanation, people say it's housing, people say it's the state of the economy, people say it's changing cultural mores. None of that maps to the fact that this is a global crisis. The challenges, the pressures that people are facing in India, and in South Africa, and in Malaysia, and in the UK are very different, and yet one thing is a constant, and that's falling fertility rate. So, look, I won't pretend to have an answer to that one, but it's absolutely the sort of thing that we need to at least be acknowledging as a problem. That's a great start.
Yeah, so on the sectarian, quite right, we need to turn the taps off, first and foremost, right? That's the good place to start, right? But then when it comes to integration, I think we need to be much more muscular about our national identity, about who we are and what our core values are. And I think you're seeing from the leading Conservative contenders for the leadership, we're going to move in that direction. I'm supporting Robert Jenrick, and I think he really gets that. And I think one of the reasons he really gets that is because he's got 3 Jewish daughters, and he's been radicalised by what he's seen on the streets of London every Saturday morning for months. Nobody who has those views should be let into our country, and we should be very clear that they're incompatible with living here and moving here. So I think we need to drop our naive double liberalism and be a bit more muscular about who we are and what our values are. In terms of fertility, I think Sam's right to say that this is a global problem, but there is still in the UK a difference between the amount of children a woman says she wants and she does have, so we can close that gap. So I think a good place to start for young people is marginal rates of tax. Elliot highlighted some of those things in his opening remarks. If you're a young professional in the southeast of England on the 40p tax band, you're not just on the 40p tax band because you're paying employees' national insurance and the student loan. You're paying 50% over 50% of your income to the state. That's before we even talk about pension contributions. We think about the housing issue. Yes, it's about not being able to get on the housing issue, but it's the cost of rents because we've not built enough as well as letting too many people into the country fundamentally. So I think there's things we can do on marginal rates of tax. I think there's things we can do on housing. But I think we should also have a more generous attitude towards childcare, right? We should be clear in being clear about who our values are, that children are good things, they are public goods, families are good things, they are public goods, and we should want to have an actively conservative with a small c policy of supporting the family, and I want to see the Conservative Party move in that direction as well.
I think on fertility, I would just speak to my own experience. I have one child. I think I'm probably unlikely to have another, and that is my personal choice. That is, I think declining fertility rates, we should acknowledge, are a symptom of women having more choices. Being a mother is not our only or our best choice anymore. That said, it is far too hard in this country. There was a period when I started working after my daughter was born where my childcare costs accounted for 90% of my income. It was, I was lucky to be able to afford to work because essentially my husband subsidised my employer. And housing contributes to this as well. You can't have a big family if you're living in a 2-bedroom flat. It's much, much harder if you don't live near your parents. We've got an increasingly atomised society. Kids can't afford to live near their parents. All of that is contributing to it. It's far harder than it should be, but I think we need to acknowledge that this is also about women making choices, making a revealed preference to have fewer children.
Some more questions, please. We'll have the gentleman right at the back of the corner.
So I believe this was said by Jack, but we're talking about repealing the Human Rights Act. What would you suggest in replacing it with in order to ensure Britons have access to the fundamental rights such as right to life and the freedom of religion that we enjoy today?
I wouldn't really replace it with anything, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think this is one of the problems and traps that we've fallen into. We've started to think that the Conservatives, or maybe the more centrist wing of the party, as they might call themselves, have started to argue that these are our constitutional norms and that to repeal them is some kind of radical anti-conservative act. It's literally just returning to what we had before 1990, was it 8, right? Which is the Parliament governs our laws. I don't think there's any real threat in this country to freedom of religion or freedom of life. You know, Parliament should be sovereign, and we shouldn't have these kind of constitutional laws that pins Parliament in, that pins ministers in, that then has justices kind of undermining democratic decisions that we've made. I think we should stop playing the left's game and say, oh, right, this is outrageous, so we have to kind of rejig this. I just think we should return to our constitutional norms in this country.
Sam?
Yeah, I think one point to bear in mind on the Human Rights Act is that in the UK we didn't gain the freedom of speech in 1998.
Right.
We've actually had it for a very long time. In large part, the process of a European human rights system was about extending rights that we in Britain had enjoyed for centuries to the rest of Europe in the post-war world. It's why actually British judges had a big hand in shaping the European Convention when it was initially drafted. It's moved on a lot since that time, but certainly when it was initially drafted, a lot of it was just about applying common law rights, which people in England have been able to vindicate for hundreds of years in many cases. Habeas corpus goes back to the 1300s, for example, applying those principles to Europe. So if we got rid of the Human Rights Act, many of those rights, in fact all of those rights, practically would still exist. They would exist as common law rights, protected first by an independent judiciary, which again is something we've had for a very long time, but also by a political constitution. Fundamentally, the UK's system is a political one and not a legal one. Our rights are guaranteed by the continued maintenance of people's liberties and freedoms by Parliament, and then in turn by the people, by the populace. So if we're going to, and I agree, by the way, I think the Human Rights Act was a terrible mistake, but if we're going to repeal it, what we have to do is we have to get people much more engaged, politicians in particular, with this rich tradition of common law rights. We need to start talking about, why is it that the government shouldn't interfere in this, that, or the other? And actually, there are very good normative reasons, but we need to make the case normatively and not legally.
2 good questions so far. Could I get some more, please? We'll have the gentleman here at the front.
Thank you. I think a facet of losing working age opinion is losing elite opinion, where the problem is even more pronounced. And when we think of the challenges of the future, migration is clearly a big one, but being more robust on that issue may draw the party even further away from elite opinion, where we need to find ways to persuade people, because they are the judiciary. They're making these decisions which are extending elements of the human rights machine even further than we would like. So how do we get through to the elites and find a way of communicating where we can actually persuade them to change their minds?
I do think that often that part of the population can lag behind where public opinion is on that, and I think immigration is a very good example of that. But one thing I would say is that I think on immigration, when you look at the polling numbers now, it's a very hard one for anyone to cut any way other than people would like to see it reduced. So 7 in 10 want to see it reduced. That's up from under half of the population even 2 years ago. So it's dramatically on the rise. And I think you can see that actually people, even if you look at now what the Labour Party's position is, at least rhetorically, even if we've not seen the policy from it yet, is to move towards this idea that saying that you want to have anything other than tougher immigration controls is not something that actually people are able to do anymore. And I've noticed that there were FT opinion pieces earlier this year that basically said, don't shoot me, but actually I think that the public want tougher immigration controls. And so I do think that even though it's lagging behind, it's actually already getting there, because when you look at it, the numbers, you can't really read them any other way, you can't really spin them any other way.
I think I mean, as I say, in my job, I talk to a lot of elites working in the city, and they do get this agenda. I mean, they do get all the things that we've been talking about. I think a big reason many of them would have voted Labour, well, partly, of course, when you're very wealthy, you're less affected by politics. So they felt able to vote Labour, but really it was to get rid of the Tories. I mean, I even speak to sort of mums in my local community who are going to be directly affected by this private school tax. You know, this is going to cost them loads of money, but they're still voting Labour because they hated the Tories so much. But I do think that, as I say, I do think the elites get this. I just think that Conservatives were so bad at articulating all the things we've been talking about while in government that they left.
Any more questions? We've got the gentleman closest to you, Darwin.
Thanks. My point is that you make the assumption, you make the kind of idea that this is all symptoms of a system that's broken. So I think from a fundamental level, I think it's important that going forward, if the Conservatives can think of the economy, the NHS and housing, immigration, as not three separate issues but one, I think, and then kind of centre their policies on that, it would resonate with a lot of voters. Because right now, for a young person, you want a house, there's already a housing crisis, and we've already got mass migration to support an already declining birth rate. So you're going to have even more competition to these houses. You want to use the NHS, you can't, you have to wait 8 weeks for an appointment with a consultant. And then the economy, obviously, so hard with childcare. You said costs 90% of your income went on childcare. So as a party, I think if we can find a way to design policy that...
Is there a question to this? Sorry.
I'm just rambling on. So my question is the party kind of changing the way it thinks about these problems rather than thinking about them as separate issues, particularly for young people, thinking of them as one? And then that might give you a good kind of clue in and read to where the cause of all these issues are, and then we can address those in terms of the young vote.
Thank you. Good one for Jack, I think.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is that the electorate are always right, and in July they gave us an absolute drubbing, and they did that in a scale not seen in a century, and they did that against a very uninspiring opposition, right? So we've got to start off with understanding the scale of our defeat, right? And that means that and that the electorate are right. So that means that we have to change. Now, one of the things that I've talked about us kind of governing within the Blairite constitutional framework, and that we need to change that next time. But I think one of the things we also have to learn is that we can't govern by focus group again. So it's felt too much that the government is governed by focus group. It's worried about what Twitter's going to say in the next 2 hours and what the Rolling News is going to say in the next hour after that. Instead of thinking about what are the structural problems the country has, what are the solutions. We might be unpopular in the shorter term, but after 4 years we can say the economy has grown. The economy has grown, and so public services are working better and that people feel better off. So I think we have to re-establish what our common creed is, why we exist, what are we here for, and we have to govern accordingly and not govern in a kind of wishy-washy focus group driven direction, which actually means after 14 years we've just had drift and things have got worse.
Any more questions? We'll go to this gentleman right at the back there.
It's just on housing, really.
Can you stand up just so
Yeah, I'll stand up. It's just on housing, really. So I'm a political assistant for a local authority, and it used to be Tory run, and then the council leader took a very, yes, let's build, 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 and we have since gone from leading the council to having 8 councillors. Because of the largely older population who were, I would say, quite NIMBY about housing, actually. It's one thing to say about housing, but you can't do it if you're not elected. So how do you actually persuade that older electorate that housing is important? Because we can't do it if we've not been elected. That's my question.
Sam, do you fancy talking about housing?
You know what? I will break my promise to myself. I will do a bit on housing, and actually, I will plug a bit of work by JL Partners. We did some work with JLP, polling basically exactly this question: how do you persuade people? You know, it's very tempting to kind of bulldoze through the housing, but as you say, for local councillors, it has huge second-order consequences. What we found is that if you, there are ways you can communicate. If you talk to older voters and you make the choice not about would you like new houses, but would you like your grandkids to be able to afford to live near you, all of a sudden opinion starts to change a little bit. because people recognise, actually, yeah, it would be really nice if my grandchildren didn't have to move down to London, they didn't have to leave the village, I could see my grandkids a little bit more. We found that there are, often, developers throw £1,000 at everybody on the street, and all of a sudden, people are much happier. There are ways that we can approach this, but if you want proof that it can work in the macro sense, I would say look at Canada. So Canadian Conservatives, as lots of people in the room will know, have become much more strident in their approach to housing. They've become a lot more aggressive, much more pro-housing, much more pro-young people. There was a poll released the other day. There are a bunch of parties in Canada, but young people under 25s, 43% said they would vote for the Conservative Party there, leading by about 20% over the Liberals. It's a huge change around from just a few years ago. And what's remarkable is that they've kept their age curve fairly flat. Old people still vote for the Conservative Party in Canada, or say they're going to at the next election, as do young people. And it's because they've employed exactly those strategies. They've made the case that more housing isn't just good for first-time buyers, it's good for communities. It keeps communities alive, keeps the high street alive, it keeps you, as an older person, in touch with your kids and grandkids, right? And those are all nice things that we should want. So I think a lot of it is rhetorical. We can do a much better job of communicating to people why they should want houses, even if they're an asset owner already.
Scarlett, I believe you want to comment on that.
Yeah, just a couple of points on that. I think it can't, as I'm sure your questioner will be aware, can't underestimate the difficulty of negotiating public opinion or leading public opinion on this particular issue. And I just got a point to illustrate that. I was doing focus groups in an expensive city in the UK, not London, outside of London, and there was virulent opposition to Labour's house building plans in this urban left-wing city and amongst this progressive voter group. And there was a woman there in her early 30s who had been made homeless by a couple of years. She'd had a bad relationship breakdown. She had young kids. She couldn't afford the local rent. And she'd been a mix of sofa surfing and safe houses. And even she said she didn't want Labour to build any more houses. She was saying things like she wants them to use buildings they already have, and had lots of other arguments. But if you've got someone who's recently been made homeless because of a lack of supply in their area, amongst other things, and they still don't want building houses, I think that shows you part of the scale of the problem that you are facing. And I think just a second point, I think Jack's absolutely right to talk about the drubbing and acknowledging just how cross the public were with the Conservative Party. And I think one thing that's been not looked at enough or not thought about enough, just to go back to focus groups again, is that I think part of what was feeding this sense of how broken Britain was, especially in some of those affluent commuter belt seats, or those sort of blue wall seats, to use that imperfect term, is actually, and again, there's something we were hearing a lot in these focus groups, is this sense of parents who had their children in their 20s, even early 30s, still living at home with them, and they couldn't understand how this was possibly fair. They brought up their children in affluent homes where they presumed their children would go on to live very rich and productive lives. And I think something that's been really underestimated was part of the reason I think they felt that 14 years of Conservative government had so failed them, was because they could see how it had failed their children. And again, these are the same voters that can be sort of quite NIMBY-ish in their tendencies in those greenbelt areas. So yeah.
Jack.
Yeah. So, speaking as a member of Parliament, the problem we often is that incentives are not wired right. So if I have a proposed housing development on the edge of a village, most of the villages will sign a petition against that development. And obviously, as a member of Parliament, my short-term political incentive is to sign the petition, join the residents with a placard in front of the fields where they walk the dogs, right? That is in my short-term political interest. But if we do that in every single instance, right, the collective action stops young people ever getting on the property ladder, right? And so, first and foremost, that's going to take some leadership and some bravery. And this comes to the point about knowing why we're here and making a powerful advocacy for that case. But we also need to help change those incentives, right? So the problem is when you build housing locally in one of the constituencies, the local community just gets the bad stuff, right? So it just gets the extra traffic, the extra pollution, the loss of green space. We need to realign the system such that there's incentives for local communities to build. The Foundation's report written a few weeks ago was quite telling. It talked about perhaps auctioning the right for the community to sell that land effectively to give that development, such that some of the finance stays locally. So it helps to try to see some of the benefit stay locally, and we need to think about clever ways of changing that incentive. I think public opinion amongst older people is changing a little bit, and I do say a little bit. You know, people are starting to get concerned about why they've not got grandkids, or why their kids live hundreds of miles away from them, or why the local schools are closing. You know, that could be part of our leadership. But I think we should also be trying to build houses in the conservative way. I think what we've done too much of, and a lot of this is government regulation that we have either introduced or not repealed, whereby, you know, the incentives are to build kind of boxless, soulless houses kind of at the edges of urban sprawl based on cars. I think we should be massively trying to increase the density in our cities. So London is half the density of Paris, say. There is no political cost whatsoever to the Conservative Party to do that, right? So it's absolute crackers, right, that we've not done that, right? And that actually is where the market wants houses, right? If we're going to grow the economy and we're going to capture what might be the artificial intelligence industrial revolution of the future, people need jobs, you know, in our most productive hubs, which is obviously at the moment is London. They don't necessarily need kind of these estates in Wiltshire. So we need to be able to say we're going to build millions of houses that works with our political incentives, i.e., you know, in London, right? But also that's a conservative way. And when we do build that density, we should do it with Kensington and Mayfair style mansion blocks and Georgian terraces, you know, such that we're building a place that our nation can be proud of for 1,000 years into the future. We need to be articulating that kind of themes as well, I think.
It sounds like you're trying to keep people out of Windsor and Maidenhead, Jack.
Well, you can build in Maidenhead, because I don't represent Maidenhead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll take 3 more questions before the end. So we'll do this gentleman here, we'll do this gentleman here, and then this gentleman at the front.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the panel something that you already talked about, basically about universities. And do you think it's time to change the degrees and what they teach? Because from my experience, so I'm in 4th year right now, I'm studying at Edinburgh University, so all my friends who graduated last year, but last academic year, are all unemployed, so they can't find a job. And I think that's a big issue. Also, university is a place of attraction of all more socialistic ideas, more extreme ideas that were not really applicable to the world, so they live in those institutions. And I think also an issue is that universities are businesses, so we have to pay so much in fees, but then we can't find a job, and people are quite upset. And I think there might be necessary to change, and I would like to know the panel's thoughts about it. Thank you.
And then it was this gentleman here.
So I am generation live with my dad at 34. Houses are cuckoo. The birth rate decline is a massive issue. In South Korea, 0.6 per woman. That's half every 20 years population. We have a oversupply of people at the moment. But my thought would be, I would like to be able to have access to a static caravan. It's going to be you could do it very quickly, very cheap. I would love to be able to go, I'm paying £200 a month rent for a caravan. And then in 20 years' time, when the baby boomers die, we can turn it back into farmland, and we won't have an oversupply of houses, which will be an issue in 10, 20, 30 years' time when baby boomers die.
Yeah, and there was a third question, yeah.
Thank you for coming. My question was on party membership. In the 1950s, I wasn't alive then, but the party membership was about 1.5 million. Now it's around 170,000. Do you think this is an issue, and do you think we should encourage mass party membership again? And would this encourage, you said the point of young people voting, would that encourage young people voting and just participating in politics in general?
So that's reform to degrees, static caravans, and party membership. Who wants to start? Yep.
Well, on degrees, you're absolutely right. I think it's something like 1 in 5 students, 1 in 5 graduates ends up worse off for having been to university. So universities are clearly not providing value for money to the students or a good experience. I think their incentives are all wrong. The incentives on a university is to take as many students as possible, and not to deliver high quality education. And I think, obviously, this goes back to my point about standards. I think as Conservatives, we should be education, brilliant education, should be one of our core values. And while we have some of the leading universities in the world, we have a lot that are crap. And we shouldn't put up with that. And of course, at the same time, we need routes into employment that aren't through the universities. It's absurd that we've got graduate requirements for so many jobs. Even in journalism, it used to be a job where you would just go and get a job on a local paper, and then you'd rise up through that way. Now it's, you spend tens of thousands of pounds on a degree in the hope of getting a bit bottom level job at a newspaper. So yeah, absolutely, we need to completely reform all routes into work and have universities be elite institutions again. And party membership, yeah, absolutely. It'd be great if we had more, 1 million members. It'd be brilliant. I think it happen.
Oh yeah, just on the party membership point, I think it's a bit, it's slightly chicken and egg in that you don't know quite which came first. I think I'd be surprised actually if the Conservatives even had 170,000 members now. I think it's constantly declining, and obviously you do get young members, but it does skew older, much like their voter base. I absolutely think that mass membership is something that would be beneficial democratically. Although it's interesting how many people you'd find here amongst the politicians. I don't know if I include Jack in this, I presume I don't, but in front of the politicians and some of the commentators who are arguing for sort of ever smaller a role for the membership and things like this. They're very scared of the membership. You certainly see that at the Labour conference with Labour politicians, given what their membership delivered for them. And so I think that's also a sort of fight you have to have. And if you're not offering, if you're trying to freeze your members out of certain very important decisions or undermine them, then is it any wonder that people are turning away from that or not signing up in the first place? And I think that's a question for both parties.
Sam?
Yeah, and just to add on the party membership point, Anthony Eden oversaw the huge spike in membership in the 1950s. We only had fewer members as a Conservative Party than the Labour Party in 1996. So the crossover only happened in the 90s. But the fact is, most people who were joining were not kind of, hard-bitten ideological Conservatives. They joined the Conservative Party because it meant they could go to Conservative clubs and go to dinners and dances, and it was a social thing for most people. They were broadly Conservative in inclination, but they were doing it to have fun. And I think a lot of what has been lost in Conservative politics is that sense of fun, of socialising. We are too keen to make everything political. Eden massively ballooned the membership by encouraging people basically into what were effectively kind of pubs and clubs up and down the country. The Labour Party, when it had its mass membership moment, and by the way, membership across all parties has declined hugely, steeply since the 1970s. When the Labour Party was successful, it was doing it because of the social network. It was through unions who in turn were providing a kind of social, not just a social space, but also a safety net in many cases. So in the age of the internet, where there is, you can connect to your friends very easily, we don't suffer for a lack of contact with our friends. We need to really think about how to make the proposition of Conservative membership attractive. And I think that has to start at the grassroots. People need to be having a lot more fun with it. Put on that dinner and don't feel the need to talk politics. Don't feel the need to invite an MP. Just make it a kind of summer barbecue, right? That kind of instinct, I think, really needs to set in. I would say if someone put me in charge tomorrow, you are banned from talking about politics for the first year. Go away and build a big social club. And then we can start getting MPs along talking politics and actually getting people re-engaged with conservatism as an idea. Let's start by getting them re-engaged with it as a social space.
And finally, Jack.
Yeah, so on universities, look, politicians shouldn't be deciding what's in university curriculums. I think that's pretty dangerous. But what we should be doing is aligning the incentives of university to get rid of some of what you described. So, for example, that could be universities have some skin in the game in terms of non-repayment of student loans, such that courses with low economic value effectively would cease to exist because universities would simply respond to their economic incentives, and you'd probably also align the political incentives to get rid of some of the rubbish kind of polytechnics that are not really universities, which Alice talked about. In terms of Jacob's question about membership, I don't think we're ever going to return to that kind of level of membership. You think you find this amongst a lot of mass membership organisations. People struggle to sign up in the way that they used to do. But I think there's 2 points. I think Sam's quite right about you've got to create a family. in any Conservative association, and the successful Conservative association I know have that family feel, and the ones that are unsuccessful are the ones where the council leader is also the deputy chairman political, who also has appointed himself to the fire authority, who's also got his wife on executive council, right, and it exists for their purpose. You've got to create a family. But I think we also have to get, and to my earlier point, the Conservative Party has to know what it's about again and needs to lead. It can't be the party of managerialism, because fundamentally, who wants to join an organisation that looks that way?
Well, I think I can safely say that we've cracked the nut and you don't need to go into more events on young people, which is brilliant. So if we could please thank the panel in the normal way. And if everybody could grab any mugs or glasses that they've used to put them on the table, please, to make it easy for the next event, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. Cheers.